In a stirring and urgent address, NATO's new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has issued a stark warning to Russian President Vladimir Putin, calling on the West to confront the mounting threat posed by Moscow. Rutte, speaking to the Carnegie Europe think tank in Brussels, emphasized that Putin's ambitions extend far beyond Ukraine. The Russian leader, he warned, is determined to wipe Ukraine off the map, and there are growing concerns that he may soon set his sights on other parts of Europe. Rutte made it clear that NATO and its allies must adopt a wartime mindset as they prepare for a prolonged struggle. He stressed that the current security situation, which has seen escalating Russian aggression, is the most dangerous Europe has faced in decades. Russia's military buildup is relentless, and the threat of further attacks is very real. "We are not ready for what is coming our way in 4 to 5 years, Rutte said, with a sense of urgency, highlighting the need for immediate and substantial increases in defense spending. This call for heightened military readiness comes amid growing concerns about the shifting balance of power in Europe and the escalating costs of war. While NATO members have agreed to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense by 2024, Rutte believes this is insufficient. The danger, he argues, is moving towards Europe at full speed, and the military alliance must now be willing to spend significantly more if it is to protect its sovereignty in the face of Russian aggression. Rutte's comments are especially poignant given the current climate in Europe. During the Cold War, NATO members spent upwards of 3% of their GDP on defense. Today, most European NATO countries fall short of the target, with some spending well below the recommended 2%. With Russia ramping up its military budget, predicted to account for 1/3 of the country's state expenditure by 2025, NATO members, particularly in Europe, are being urged to follow suit. In his speech, Rutte made a direct plea to the citizens of NATO countries, urging them to understand the stakes at hand. "If we don't spend more now to prevent war, we will pay a much higher price later to fight it," he warned. The specter of a future conflict looms large, and Rutte stressed the importance of long-term investments in defense. He recognized that for many Europeans, defense spending might feel like an uncomfortable trade-off, as voters increasingly focus on domestic issues like rising living costs and healthcare. However, he implored them to consider the future of their children and grandchildren, asking them to prioritize the preservation of democracy, freedom, and Western values. Rutte's address came at a pivotal moment as the war in Ukraine grinds on. Russian forces have steadily advanced in the eastern regions of Ukraine, capturing 6 times as much territory in 2024 as they did in the previous year. Meanwhile, NATO's role in supporting Ukraine remains crucial, with member states providing unprecedented levels of assistance to help Ukraine defend itself. Rutte condemned Russia's brutal and unprovoked aggression, reaffirming NATO's commitment to upholding Ukraine's right to self-defense. But the dangers extend beyond Ukraine. Rutte specifically warned that Moscow is preparing for a long-term confrontation, not only with Ukraine, but with NATO itself. As Russia continues to bolster its military capabilities, NATO must act swiftly to secure its own future. The key, Rutte argued, lies in unity and preparedness. NATO's 32 members must turbocharge their defense spending to ensure they are ready for whatever may come. The growing threat from Russia was underscored by recent reports of drone attacks on Ukrainian and Russian targets. In Chechnya, Russian officials reported that a Ukrainian drone strike had hit a police barracks, injuring several people. Similarly, in occupied territories like Crimea, Russian forces claim to have shot down a number of drones, further highlighting the increasingly complex and dangerous nature of the conflict. These small, nimble drone strikes are becoming an increasingly potent weapon for both sides in the war, underscoring the changing nature of modern warfare. In addition, Russia's response to Ukraine's use of US-supplied ATACMS missiles has been swift and resolute. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov vowed that Moscow would retaliate, signaling the possibility of further missile attacks. With Russia continuing to develop and test hypersonic ballistic missiles, the situation remains volatile, and the West must be prepared for the possibility of escalation. If Russia continues its aggressive war in Ukraine and escalates its confrontations with NATO, several possible outcomes could unfold. Each would have profound implications not only for regional security but also for the global economy. The ongoing war in Ukraine remains at the center of the crisis. Russian forces have steadily advanced in the eastern regions, capturing significantly more territory in 2024 compared to the previous year. NATO's continued support for Ukraine through unprecedented levels of military and financial aid is crucial for the country's defense. However, the longer the conflict persists, the greater the strain on NATO resources and cohesion among its members. Beyond Ukraine, the threat of Russian aggression looms over NATO's eastern flank. Countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are particularly vulnerable. If Russia begins threatening or targeting these nations, it could trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty, potentially leading to a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia. The increasing use of advanced weaponry, such as hypersonic missiles and drone swarms, heightens the risk of widespread destruction and civilian casualties. Neighboring countries, including Moldova and Georgia, are also at risk of increased Russian aggression. These nations, already grappling with Russian-backed separatist movements, could see further destabilization. Belarus, a close ally of Moscow, might become more directly involved in the conflict, complicating the regional dynamics and pushing more countries to seek NATO or EU membership. A prolonged war would exacerbate Europe's energy instability. Russia, one of the world's largest exporters of oil and natural gas, has already weaponized its energy supplies. Further disruptions could lead to soaring energy prices, driving inflation worldwide. European nations already strained by the cost of transitioning away from Russian energy may face shortages and increased reliance on expensive imports. Ukraine, a major exporter of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, has seen its agricultural output severely impacted by the war. Disruptions to global food supplies would particularly affect countries in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia that depend on Ukrainian grain. Combined with sanctions on Russia, the world's largest fertilizer exporter, global food prices could spike, leading to hunger and social unrest in vulnerable regions. The war has already disrupted critical supply chains, including key metals like nickel, palladium, and titanium, essential for industries such as automotive and electronics. Prolonged conflict would deepen these shortages, increasing production costs and slowing economic growth worldwide. Western sanctions have isolated Russia economically, but they have also led to the formation of rival economic blocs. Countries like China and India have deepened trade ties with Russia, challenging the dominance of Western-led economic systems. This polarization could further destabilize global markets and undermine the US dollar's role in international trade. Rising defense spending among NATO countries could divert funds from social programs, infrastructure, and climate initiatives, dampening economic growth. Emerging markets, already grappling with debt and inflation, would face additional challenges as high interest rates persist. Geopolitical instability could create volatility in financial markets. Investors might flock to safe haven assets like gold, while emerging markets experience capital outflows. Stock markets in energy-dependent and export-driven economies would face turbulence, potentially leading to recessions. Millions more could be displaced by the conflict, creating one of the largest refugee crises since World War II. European nations would face mounting pressures to accommodate refugees, straining their social and economic systems. The global community would also struggle to meet increased demands for humanitarian aid. A prolonged war could undermine the credibility of international organizations like the United Nations, which have struggled to mediate the conflict effectively. The erosion of the global rules-based order could embolden other authoritarian regimes. If Russia continues its war in Ukraine, the ramifications for the global economy would be severe and long-lasting. Energy shortages, food insecurity, supply chain disruptions, and heightened defense spending would combine to slow global growth, exacerbate inequality, and deepen divisions between nations. The prolonged instability could lead to a reordering of global power dynamics, with emerging blocs forming around competing economic and political ideologies. For NATO and the West, the choice is stark. Invest heavily in defense and deterrence now to prevent further Russian aggression or risk facing an even costlier conflict in the future. For the world at large, finding a way to resolve the conflict is not just a matter of regional security. It is essential for global stability and economic resilience. The urgency of Mark Rutte's message cannot be overstated. Europe and NATO are at a critical juncture in this ongoing conflict. The reality is that if Russia is allowed to continue expanding its military influence and territorial gains, the balance of power in Europe will dramatically shift. NATO's ability to deter further aggression will be determined by how well its member states respond to Rutte's call for action. If Europe doesn't prepare now, the consequences of complacency could be devastating. Mark Rutte's warning is not just a call to action, it's a wake-up call for the entire NATO alliance. As Russia's military capabilities grow and Putin's ambitions become clearer, NATO must brace itself for an uncertain and potentially devastating future. Rutte's plea for increased defense spending is both practical and essential. The security of Europe and the protection of democratic values depends on NATO's ability to act decisively and in unity. Europe must be prepared to make tough choices. While prioritizing defense may require sacrifices in other areas, the stakes are too high to ignore. NATO's future depends on the collective will of its member states to rise to the occasion, bolster their military readiness, and ensure that Russia's aggression is met with strength and resilience. If the West fails to act decisively now, the cost of inaction could be far greater in the years to come.